I am Natalie, 33 years old, and I am the founder of a cloud data archiving company, though my in-laws love to tell their country club friends that I am just a hired data entry clerk. Before I get into the details of exactly how I dismantled my mother-in-law's fake high society life, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to a toxic family member who thought they could walk all over you because they had a little bit of money. We were standing in the grand living room of Beverly's massive estate. Christmas Eve was supposed to be a time for family, but for Beverly, it was an annual performance. The room smelled of fresh pine needles and expensive cinnamon candles. The massive stone fireplace was blazing, casting long shadows across the imported Italian marble floors. I had brought the diary down from the guest room because the holidays were always hard for me and I wanted to feel close to my mom. It was a simple, scuffed brown leather notebook. To anyone else, it probably looked like junk. But to me, it was my entire world. It was the very last physical object my mother had handed to me before she passed away. Beverly snatched it right off the side table when I turned my back to pour a glass of water. I barely had time to register her manicured fingers, gripping the worn leather before she was holding it directly over the open flames. She turned to me, her diamond tennis bracelet catching the firelight. She said, "Natalie, I have told you 100 times. We do not keep poverty trinkets in this house. This is a $2 million home, not a flea market for your mother's sad little memories." Then she simply opened her hand and dropped it. The fire swallowed the book instantly. The old paper went up in a bright orange flash. I lunged forward, the intense heat hitting my face, but the flames were already curling around the pages, turning my mother's familiar handwriting into black ash. Beverly just smirked. She actually stood there and smirked at me. She adjusted the collar of her silk blouse and told me I should be thanking her for decluttering the living space. She said someone had to teach me how to let go of my lower-class baggage if I was ever going to truly fit in with their social circle. She called my mother a nobody. She called my memories pathetic. The sheer cruelty of her words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. I stood there completely frozen, watching the leather cover curl and blacken in the blistering heat. I turned desperately to my husband Spencer, expecting him to do something. Anything. We had been married for 3 years, and he was supposed to be my partner. He was supposed to be the man who protected me. Instead, Spencer leaned back against the custom velvet sofa, slowly swirling his glass of Cabernet. He did not even look at the fire. He looked at me with this expression of mild annoyance, like I was a toddler throwing a tantrum in a grocery store. He sighed loudly, rolling his eyes. He said, "Natalie, please do not make a scene tonight. Mom is right. You have been hoarding that old thing for years and it was starting to smell musty. It is just an old book. Drink your wine and stop overreacting. We have important guests coming tomorrow and I will not have you ruining the holiday mood with your dramatic crying." The betrayal hit me harder than Beverly's cruelty. The man who stood at the altar and promised to protect me was sitting comfortably on a velvet couch, actively defending the woman who had just incinerated my most prized possession. He chose his mother's comfort over my profound grief, just like he always did. That was when Jamal finally moved. Jamal is my sister-in-law's husband. He is a brilliant forensic accountant and a proud Black American man who has always seen right through Beverly's country club facade. Jamal is the only person in this entire family who actually works for a living instead of relying on old money and trust funds. He jumped up from his leather armchair, grabbing the heavy iron fireplace poker from the stand. He rushed toward the hearth, trying to hook the diary and pull it out of the flames. He completely ignored the searing heat, his face set in grim determination as he tried to save whatever was left of the charred pages. But Beverly stepped right into his path. She put her hand flat against Jamal's chest, physically stopping him from rescuing the book. Her voice dropped to that sugary, condescending tone she always used when she wanted to put someone in their place while maintaining her polite society smile. She looked Jamal up and down and said, "Jamal, dear, let it burn. I know where you come from. People hold on to every little scrap they can find. But in our family, we understand that holding onto trash only brings the property value down. You really need to learn the rules of high society if you want to keep sitting at this table. It was a vile, thinly veiled insult dripping with the kind of casual prejudice and elitism she was famous for. Jamal's jaw clenched tightly. He gripped the iron poker so hard his knuckles turned gray. I could see the absolute fury in his eyes, but he looked over at his wife, who was nervously looking down at her expensive shoes, and he slowly lowered the tool. He stepped back from the fire, but he locked eyes with me, sending a clear message of silent, unwavering solidarity. He knew what she was doing. He saw her exactly for who she was. I did not cry. I did not scream. As the last of the brown leather turned to gray ash and floated up the chimney, a strange, absolute calm washed over me. It was a cold, terrifying clarity. What Beverly thought she had burned was a pathetic book of old poems and family recipes. What she had actually burned was the physical backup of my master seed phrase. It was the manually written, heavily encrypted key to the cloud servers of my tech startup. The very startup that currently held the digital footprint of every illegal wire transfer, every fake loan application, and every forged signature Beverly had made over the last decade to fund her luxurious lifestyle. My silence filled the massive room. Beverly smiled, thinking she had finally broken my spirit and taught me a lesson about my place in her house. Spencer smiled, glad that the uncomfortable moment had passed without a shouting match. But it was not the silence of a broken woman. It was the highly calculated silence of someone who just realized the game was entirely over and I was holding all the winning cards. The ash of my mother's diary was still floating up the chimney and disappearing into the cold winter night. Beverly smoothed the front of her expensive silk blouse with a triumphant smile plastered across her face. She truly believed she had just shattered my spirit completely. She thought she had stripped me of my past and my dignity in one swift, unapologetic motion. But the night was far from over. In her twisted mind, the destruction of my mother's memory was just the opening act to soften me up. Now it was time for the main event. Beverly walked gracefully over to the grand piano where her designer crocodile skin handbag was resting. She unclasped it with a sharp snap that echoed loudly in the quiet living room. She reached inside and pulled out a crisp, heavy piece of paper. She held it up delicately between her perfectly manicured fingers, making sure the warm firelight caught the intricate watermarks on the document. "You see," Natalie Beverly began, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness and deep condescension. "There are two types of people in this world: those who cling to worthless sentimental trash, and those who build actual legacies." She walked back toward the center of the room, waving the paper slightly in the air like a victory flag. "This right here is a check for $500,000. It is a mere advance from our family trust fund. Pocket change really for the kind of investments we are making next quarter. But to someone from your background, I am sure it looks like lottery money." I stared at the check, keeping my expression entirely blank and unreadable. I knew exactly what that trust fund was, and I knew exactly whose name was required to authorize a financial withdrawal of that magnitude. But Beverly was entirely oblivious to what I knew. She puffed out her chest, pacing the imported Italian rug, like a queen inspecting her loyal subjects. That was when my husband decided to make his grand move. Spencer stood up from the custom velvet sofa, adjusting the cuffs of his tailored dress shirt. He did not look at me with sympathy or regret. He looked at me like a business problem that needed to be aggressively solved. He walked over to his heavy leather briefcase, resting near the wet bar, popped the brass locks open, and pulled out a thick stack of legal documents bound by a navy blue cover. He walked back to the heavy oak coffee table that sat between us and dropped the documents right in front of me. The heavy thud of the paper hitting the solid wood made my sister-in-law flinch, but Jamal kept his eyes locked firmly on Spencer, his jaw set tight with anger. "What is this?" I asked, my voice steady, betraying absolutely none of the adrenaline coursing through my veins. Spencer let out a loud, heavy sigh, acting as if explaining this simple concept to me was a massive, agonizing burden. It is a post-nuptial agreement, Natalie. Mom and I had our corporate lawyers drafted up last week. It is time we start acting like a real family that actively protects its assets. You have been playing around with that little data entry startup of yours for long enough. It is time to get serious and secure our financial future. I reached out and flipped open the first page of the contract. The legal jargon was incredibly dense, but I did not need an advanced law degree to understand what I was looking at. Clause after clause was specifically designed to strip me down to nothing. Spencer tapped his index finger impatiently against the thick paper. "It is very simple," he said, his tone turning cold and demanding. "You will transfer 100% of your equity in your little scanning project directly into my name. In exchange, Mom is generously willing to let you take over the entire mortgage payments for this house. You have been living here under her roof for 3 years, Natalie. It is time you started pulling your weight financially instead of just coasting on our family name." I actually let out a short, dry laugh. The sheer, unadulterated audacity of their plan was staggering. They wanted me to surrender the entirety of my company, the tech startup that was actually a highly profitable cloud data archiving firm, and in return they wanted me to assume the massive $2 million debt of Beverly's underwater mansion. They were actively trying to trap me in their sinking financial ship while completely stealing my only life raft. Beverly leaned in close, placing the $500,000 check on the table right next to the predatory post-nuptial agreement. It was a calculated visual threat. "Do not be ungrateful, Natalie," she sneered, her polite mask slipping to reveal the venom underneath. "We are offering you a rare chance to finally contribute to this wealthy family. You should be honored. Without us, you are absolutely nothing. You have no family. Your mother is gone forever. Her silly little book is a pile of ash. All you have is Spencer. And if you want to keep your marriage intact, you will sign that paper right now." Spencer pulled a heavy silver fountain pen from his breast pocket and laid it deliberately on top of the contract. "Just sign it, Natalie. Do not make this harder than it has to be. You saw what just happened to the diary. You do not want to see what happens to your life if you refuse to cooperate with us. If you do not sign this tonight, you can pack your bags and walk out into the freezing snow. We will make sure you leave this marriage with absolutely nothing but the clothes on your back." They stood there shoulder to shoulder, a mother and son, deeply united by greed and entitlement. They thought they had successfully backed me into an inescapable corner. They genuinely believed the sight of a $500,000 check would intimidate me into absolute submission, proving how vastly outmatched I was in wealth and social power. They thought tearing away my mother's memory had left me emotionally shattered and totally ready to surrender my life's work. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Jamal quietly shift his weight. As a senior forensic accountant, he had been scanning the documents upside down from across the glass table. I could see the analytical gears turning rapidly in his head. He immediately recognized the name of the trust fund printed on Beverly's check. He recognized the highly predatory language written in Spencer's contract. He knew exactly what kind of illegal financial trap they were trying to pull on me. I slowly reached out and picked up the silver fountain pen. The cold metal felt heavy and solid in my hand. Beverly's cruel smirk widened into a full-blown grin of ultimate victory. Spencer let out a long breath of relief, crossing his arms over his chest like a triumphant chief executive officer who had just successfully closed a hostile corporate takeover. They were so incredibly eager for my surrender that they completely failed to notice my hand was not shaking at all. I looked down at the blank signature line, then looked up at my husband's incredibly smug face, quietly preparing to deliver the first devastating blow to their fragile, fake empire. I held the silver fountain pen, hovering just inches above the thick paper. The room was so quiet, I could hear the crackle of the remaining embers in the fireplace, where my mother's diary had just been reduced to ash. Beverly was practically vibrating with excitement. Spencer had a smug, victorious grin plastered across his face. But before the nib of the pen could even touch the dotted line, a deep, calm voice cut through the heavy silence. "Hold on a second, Natalie." It was Jamal. He stepped away from the heavy leather armchair and walked deliberately toward the center of the room. His presence instantly shifted the energy in the space. Spencer immediately bristled, his victorious grin melting into a furious scowl. He took a quick step forward, trying to physically block Jamal from reaching the coffee table, but Jamal simply sidestepped him with the grace of someone who refused to be intimidated. He reached down and smoothly pulled the postnuptial agreement and the $500,000 check right out from under my hand. "What do you think you are doing?" Spencer snapped, his voice echoing loudly off the high ceilings. "This is a private financial matter between my wife and me." "Back off, Jamal. You are completely overstepping your boundaries here." Jamal did not even look at him. He adjusted his glasses and held the documents up to the warm light of the crystal chandelier. As a senior forensic accountant, Jamal spent his entire professional life hunting down hidden assets, exposing corporate fraud, and tearing apart bulletproof financial contracts. He made a living entirely out of catching liars who thought they were smarter than the system. He read through the dense legal jargon, with terrifying speed, his eyes darting back and forth across the pages. "This is not a private marital matter," Spencer Jamal said, his voice steady and commanding. "This is a poorly executed financial trap. And frankly, it is incredibly insulting to my intelligence." He tossed the contract back onto the table with a loud, sharp slap. He pointed directly at the second page of the document, tapping it with his index finger. Clause 4, Section B, he recited perfectly, without even looking back at the paper. "This does not just transfer her company equity into your name. This specific wording legally indemnifies both you and your mother from any existing debts tied to this property, while transferring the entire liability solely onto Natalie. You are not giving her the house out of the goodness of your heart. You are actively making her the sole guarantor of a defaulted mortgage." Spencer turned bright red, a vein pulsing visibly in his forehead. "You have absolutely no idea what you are talking about," he stammered, taking another aggressive step forward. "That is standard legal boilerplate language drawn up by top-tier corporate lawyers." "No, it is financial suicide," Jamal fired back, stepping right into Spencer's personal space, refusing to yield an inch. He picked up the heavy, crisp check that Beverly had proudly flaunted and held it between his fingers. "And this check is even worse than the contract. Do you really think I do not recognize the routing structure of the Vanguard Horizon Trust? I audit corporate accounts 10 times this size before I even have my morning coffee. This check is completely invalid." Beverly let out a sharp, high-pitched fake laugh, trying desperately to regain control of the room. "Do not be ridiculous, Jamal. It is a certified bank draft from our family estate. You are just trying to stir up unnecessary drama because you feel left out." Jamal turned to her, his expression deadpan and entirely devoid of amusement. "It is a piece of paper with missing authorization, Beverly. The Vanguard Horizon Trust requires dual signatory approval for any single withdrawal over $50,000. Unless you have the direct signature of the board chairman sitting right beside yours, this check will bounce the exact second it hits the teller desk. You're trying to buy her highly profitable company with monopoly money." The room went completely still. Beverly's face completely drained of color. The polite high society mask she wore so carefully completely slipped off, revealing the absolute panic underneath. Spencer clenched his fists, his breathing turning heavy and erratic. They had relied entirely on my emotional vulnerability and my lack of financial literacy to pull off this massive heist. They never once anticipated that a seasoned auditor would casually dismantle their entire scheme in less than 2 minutes. "Give me that paperwork right now!" Spencer yelled suddenly, lunging across the table for the documents. Jamal snatched them out of reach, easily blocking Spencer with his broad shoulder and pushing him back. "Are you really this desperate?" Jamal asked, shaking his head in profound disgust. "You're supposed to be her husband. You stood at an altar and swore to protect her. Instead, you are trying to scam her out of the only thing she has built for herself just to cover up your mother's reckless spending habits. You are pathetic, Spencer." That was the exact moment Beverly completely lost her mind. She marched across the room, her expensive designer heels clicking aggressively against the marble floor. She pointed a shaking manicured finger right at Jamal's face. Her eyes were wide and filled with a venomous, hateful rage that I had never fully seen before. "You listen to me right now, you ungrateful outsider," she hissed, her voice shaking with pure malice. "We welcomed you into this family. We gave you a seat at our table. You might think you are so smart with your little numbers and your spreadsheets, but you have absolutely no idea who you are dealing with. I have been a platinum member of the Oak Ridge Country Club for 25 years. I sit on the charity executive boards with the senior partners of your accounting firm." Jamal stared down at her, completely unfazed by her tantrum. "Is that a threat, Beverly?" "It is a promise," she snarled, stepping even closer until she was right in his face. "If you do not put those papers down and walk out of my house this instant, I will make one phone call tomorrow morning. Just one. And I will have you fired before you even finish your morning commute. I will personally ensure your professional reputation is completely destroyed in this city. You will never work in corporate finance again. I will ruin you, just like I will ruin her." The threat hung in the air, toxic and heavy. Beverly was breathing hard, fully expecting Jamal to cower and apologize. She was entirely used to bullying service workers and family members into absolute submission with her fake wealth and social connections. But Jamal just smiled. It was a cold, calculating smile that sent a shiver down my spine. He looked over at his wife, Nia, who was standing near the doorway. Nia nodded at him, a silent, unwavering confirmation that she was completely on his side and entirely disgusted by her own mother and brother. "Make the call," Beverly Jamal said, his voice practically a whisper, but carrying across the large room. "Please, call the senior partners. Tell them exactly why you want me fired. Tell them it is because I stopped you from committing felony bank fraud and financial extortion against your own daughter-in-law. I am sure the federal financial investigators would absolutely love to hear that recorded conversation." Beverly stumbled back a step as if she had been physically struck across the face. She opened her mouth to speak, but absolutely nothing came out. Spencer looked back and forth between his mother and Jamal, completely out of his depth and realizing the walls were rapidly closing in. Jamal turned his back on them, completely dismissing their fake authority. He looked down at me, his eyes softening with genuine brotherly concern. He pointed at the silver fountain pen, still resting securely in my hand. "Put the pen down, Natalie," he said firmly. "Do not sign a single word. They have absolutely nothing on you. They are terrified, and they are drowning in their own debt. Do not let them drag you down with them." I looked at the heavy silver pen. I looked at Spencer, who was sweating profusely, his eyes darting around the room in absolute panic. Then I looked at Beverly, who was clutching her chest, staring at Jamal with a mixture of pure hatred and undeniable fear. I slowly placed the pen back onto the glass coffee table. The soft click of the metal hitting the glass sounded like a judge slamming a heavy gavel. The trap had been completely dismantled. The suffocating tension in the massive living room was suddenly broken by a loud, sharp sound. The grand brass doorbell echoed heavily through the long marble hallways of the mansion. It was Christmas Eve, and outside the massive floor-to-ceiling windows, a brutal winter blizzard was raging. The wind was howling violently against the thick glass panes burying the expensive landscaping under feet of heavy white snow. Nobody was expecting any guests tonight. Beverly had made absolutely sure that this evening was an exclusive private family gathering designed specifically to corner me and force me to sign away my company. Spencer jumped slightly at the sudden ringing sound, wiping a thin layer of cold sweat from his forehead. Beverly snapped her head toward the grand foyer, her chest heaving, as she desperately tried to compose herself after Jamal had thoroughly humiliated her. She quickly smoothed down the front of her expensive silk blouse and forced her fake high society smile back onto her face. She nodded sharply at the uniformed maid standing quietly in the corner, ordering her to go answer the door immediately. The maid hurried across the imported Italian marble floor and pulled open the heavy, solid oak front door. A freezing gust of winter wind instantly swept into the warm house, bringing a violent swirl of white snowflakes with it. Standing there in the doorway, completely framed by the raging dark blizzard, was my 82-year-old grandfather, Harrison. He looked entirely out of place in Beverly's pristine $2 million home. Harrison was wearing a thick, faded green wool coat that looked like it had barely survived 3 different decades of harsh winters. The elbows were worn incredibly thin, and the collar was badly frayed at the edges. He had an old hand-knitted scarf wrapped tightly around his neck and a pair of heavy scuffed leather work boots that were currently tracking melting gray snow onto the incredibly expensive entrance rug. He looked tired, he looked cold, and he looked entirely unassuming. He slowly pulled off his wet wool cap, revealing his thinning gray hair, and stepped inside, shaking the heavy snow from his broad shoulders. For a brief, agonizing moment, the entire room stared at him in absolute stunned silence. I felt a massive, overwhelming wave of relief wash over me seeing his familiar, comforting face, but I stayed completely quiet, knowing I needed to let this exact scene play out without any interference. Then Beverly started to laugh. It started as a low, cruel chuckle in the back of her throat and very quickly escalated into a loud, hysterical, shrieking laugh that echoed wildly off the high, vaulted ceilings. She threw her head back, practically vibrating with a toxic mix of nervous relief and pure, unadulterated malice. In her deeply twisted mind, the sudden, unexpected appearance of my grandfather was a magical gift from the universe. Jamal had just brutally exposed her massive financial fraud and stripped away her fake power, but right here standing on her rug was an easy target. Here was an old man who looked like he had just crawled out of a downtown homeless shelter. He was the absolute perfect victim for her to project all her lingering rage and deep social insecurity onto. "Well, look what the freezing winter wind blew in," Beverly mocked loudly, marching toward the grand foyer, with her designer heels clicking sharply and aggressively against the stone floor. "I suppose it was only a matter of time before the rest of your pathetic lower-class family came crawling to my front door looking for a generous holiday handout, Natalie." She stopped just a few feet away from Harrison, looking him up and down with an expression of profound, extreme disgust. She literally pinched her nose, acting as if he was carrying some kind of contagious disease that might permanently infect her expensive, imported furniture. Harrison did not say a single word in response. He just stood there, calmly unbuttoning his damp winter coat, his sharp, intelligent eyes slowly scanning the room. He took in the sight of my destroyed diary turning to ash in the fireplace, the predatory legal documents resting on the coffee table, and the absolute sheer panic hiding just behind Beverly's cruel, wicked smile. Beverly turned her head and snapped her fingers loudly at the maid, who was still hovering nervously near the open door. "Maria, go into the kitchen right now," Beverly ordered, her voice dripping with extreme condescension and fake authority. "Get some of the leftover turkey scraps from dinner and put them in a cheap plastic container. Do not use the good containers. It looks like this poor, penniless beggar has not had a hot, decent meal in a solid week. We should do our Christian charity for the holidays and give the freezing old man some leftover dog food before we send him back out into the freezing blizzard." Spencer, completely desperate to regain some tiny shred of his shattered masculinity after Jamal had entirely backed him down, stepped forward to aggressively join his mother. He crossed his arms over his chest and let out a smug, arrogant sigh, trying to look physically intimidating. "You really need to leave right now," Harrison Spencer said, trying his hardest to sound tough and authoritative. "This is a private luxury residence, and you are tracking dirty street slush all over a custom rug that costs more than your entire life savings. Take the garbage food from the kitchen and go find a bus stop before I physically throw you out into the snow myself." Harrison ignored Spencer completely. It was as if my husband did not even exist in the room. His eyes remained fixed firmly and intensely on Beverly. His absolute, unwavering silence seemed to irritate her even more. She desperately needed him to cower. She needed him to feel incredibly small so she could feel incredibly big again. Beverly marched quickly back over to the heavy oak coffee table and snatched up the $500,000 check. The very same check Jamal had just definitively proven was completely invalid and utterly worthless. But Beverly was so deeply, blindly invested in her own massive delusions of grandeur that she still truly thought the piece of paper gave her ultimate godlike power over everyone in the room. She held the crisp check high up in the air, waving it dramatically and frantically toward my grandfather. "Do you see this little piece of paper?" Old man Beverly sneered, her eyes wide and completely manic. "This is $500,000. It is just a tiny little advance from our massive family trust fund. It is literal pocket change for people like us. I was just generously offering your deeply ungrateful granddaughter a rare chance to finally elevate herself out of the miserable, disgusting poverty you raised her in." But clearly the bad apple does not fall far from the rotting trash can. You people are all exactly the same. You have absolutely nothing to your names, and you just want to drag successful, wealthy, prominent people down into the dirty mud with you. She took another aggressive step toward him, holding the check out as if taunting a starving stray animal with a piece of fresh premium meat. "You will never, ever see this kind of money in your entire pathetic life, Harrison. Not even if you lived for another 200 years. So take your little scraps from my kitchen and get out of my house right this second before I have the local police arrest you for trespassing, vagrancy, and being a public nuisance." I watched the entire chaotic interaction with a steady, pounding heart. Jamal stood right beside me, his arms firmly crossed over his broad chest, an incredibly tight and knowing smile forming right on his lips. Nia was watching with wide, shocked eyes, completely mesmerized by the unfolding disaster happening in her mother's living room. Harrison finally finished taking off his thick, wet wool gloves. He tucked them slowly and deliberately into the deep, oversized pockets of his shabby green coat. He did not look humiliated at all. He did not look even slightly angry. He looked at Beverly with the exact kind of mild, disappointed pity a rational adult person might reserve for a loud, misbehaving child throwing a massive, embarrassing tantrum in a public grocery store. He stepped fully out of the cold foyer and into the warm, bright light of the grand living room, his heavy, wet boots making a solid, definitive thudding sound against the floor. He walked right past Spencer, completely brushing past his shoulder and ignoring his existence. He walked right up to Beverly, stopping just mere inches away from the waving $500,000 check. The final ultimate trap had been flawlessly set, and Beverly had just gleefully and arrogantly walked right into the dead center of it, entirely blind to the absolute legal and financial destruction that was about to rain down on her perfect, fake little world. The heavy thud of my grandfather Harrison's wet boots against the imported marble floor sounded like the steady beating of a war drum. He completely ignored the barrage of cruel insults flying out of Beverly's mouth. He did not look at her perfectly manicured finger pointing aggressively in his face. He did not even glance at Spencer, who was puffing out his chest, trying desperately to look like the man of the house. Harrison simply kept walking, his eyes locked entirely on the heavy oak coffee table sitting in the center of the room. The air in the living room grew incredibly thick and suffocating. You could feel the raw electric tension radiating from every single person standing there. Beverly kept talking, her voice growing louder and more frantic as she realized her bullying was having absolutely zero effect on this old man. She demanded that he turn around. She threatened to call the country club security. She threatened to call the local police. But her words just bounced off him like rain against a brick wall. He stepped right up to the edge of the expensive woven rug, stopping just inches away from the glass table. The $500,000 check was sitting right there, illuminated by the warm light of the crystal chandelier. It was crisp and heavy, printed on expensive bank paper, with the Vanguard Horizon Trust watermarks clearly visible. Right next to it was the predatory post-nuptial agreement that Spencer had tried to force me to sign. Harrison slowly looked down at the documents. He stood perfectly still for a long, terrifying moment. His breathing was slow and steady. "Do not even think about touching that!" Beverly shrieked, her voice suddenly pitching up into a hysterical panic. "That piece of paper is worth more than your entire miserable life. Step away from the table right now, you filthy old beggar!" Harrison did not step away. Instead, he reached out with his weathered, calloused hands. These were hands that had built a massive financial empire from the ground up, hands that knew the absolute value of hard work and quiet power. He bypassed the post-nuptial agreement completely and picked up the $500,000 check. The moment his thick fingers grasped the crisp paper, the entire room seemed to hold its collective breath. Spencer actually took a nervous step backward, his fake bravado completely evaporating. Jamal shifted his weight slightly, dropping his shoulders and planting his feet firmly, clearly preparing to physically intervene if Spencer or Beverly tried to attack the old man. I stood there, absolutely mesmerized, my heart hammering violently against my ribs. Harrison held the check up, studying it in the light. He looked at the forged signature on the bottom line. He looked at the massive number printed across the center. And then, without saying a single word, he gripped the edges of the check and pulled his hands apart. The sound of the thick bank paper tearing was incredibly loud in the dead silent room. It was a sharp, aggressive ripping noise that cut straight through the tension like a razor blade. He tore the check straight down the middle, splitting the $500,000 directly in half. Beverly let out a sound that was somewhere between a gasp and a strangled scream. Her hands flew up to cover her mouth, her eyes widening to the size of saucers. She looked like she had just witnessed a horrific, violent crime. But Harrison was not done. He placed the two torn halves together and ripped them again. The sharp tearing sound echoed off the high vaulted ceilings a second time. Then he stacked the four pieces and tore them again. His movements were slow, methodical, and completely devoid of any anger. He was not acting out of rage. He was acting with the absolute calm authority of a man who owned the entire room. He kept folding and tearing the thick paper until the $500,000 check was reduced to a handful of tiny, jagged confetti squares. When he could not tear the pieces any smaller, he simply opened his large hands. The tiny scraps of paper fluttered down like snow, falling directly onto Beverly's precious custom rug. They landed softly on the intricate woven patterns, completely destroying the visual illusion of her massive wealth and power. The silence that followed was deafening. It was the kind of heavy, paralyzing silence that immediately follows a massive car crash. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. We all just stared at the tiny pieces of destroyed paper resting on the floor. Then the shock finally wore off and the volcanic rage erupted. Beverly completely lost whatever tiny shred of sanity she had left. Her face turned a deep, blotchy shade of purple. The veins in her neck bulged against her skin. She looked down at the ruined check and then up at Harrison, her entire body violently shaking with a level of anger I had never witnessed before. "You crazy old fool!" she screamed, her voice tearing through her throat, sounding like a cornered wild animal. "Do you have any idea what you just did? That was $500,000. That was my money. You just destroyed my money, you stupid, worthless peasant!" She lunged forward, her manicured hands curled into sharp claws aiming directly for Harrison's face, but she did not even make it halfway across the rug. Jamal moved with terrifying speed, stepping firmly between Beverly and my grandfather. He held up one massive hand, easily blocking her advance without even having to touch her. "Take one more step toward him, Beverly, and I promise you will regret it for the rest of your life," Jamal said, his voice incredibly low and dangerously calm. Spencer finally snapped out of his shock and ran over, grabbing his mother by the shoulders to pull her back. He was sweating profusely, completely terrified of Jamal, and entirely confused by what had just happened. He looked at Harrison like the old man was a dangerous, unpredictable lunatic. "You are going to jail for this," Spencer yelled, pointing a shaking finger at Harrison. "That is destruction of private property. That is grand larceny. You are going to spend the rest of your miserable, pathetic life rotting in a federal prison cell." Beverly was hyperventilating, clinging to Spencer's arm, her chest heaving as she stared at the scraps of paper on her rug. "Call the police, Spencer!" She gasped out tears of pure, frustrated rage, finally spilling down her cheeks, ruining her expensive makeup. "Call 911 right now. Have this filthy old man dragged out of my house in handcuffs. I want him arrested. I want him locked up. I want him destroyed." I watched my grandfather standing there in his shabby wet winter coat, towering over the emotional wreckage he had just effortlessly created. For years, I had allowed Beverly and Spencer to dictate my worth based on their bank accounts and their country club memberships. I had let them make me feel small, because I did not come from their fake version of high society. But watching Harrison completely dismantle their false idol with nothing but his bare hands, an absolute silence shifted something deep inside my soul. The incredible illusion of their power was broken forever. They were not wealthy elites holding my future hostage. They were just deeply in debt, desperate bullies clinging to a piece of paper that never even belonged to them in the first place. Beverly was still weeping uncontrollably, her knees actually buckling slightly as she stared at the ruined check. It was the absolute height of irony. Just minutes ago, she had stood over the fireplace and smirked, while she watched the last physical memory of my mother turn into ash. She had told me that holding on to things was a sign of weakness. Now she was completely falling apart, crying hysterically over a few torn shreds of paper. Spencer pulled his phone from his pocket, his fingers trembling so badly he could barely unlock the screen. "You are done, old man," he muttered repeatedly, his voice cracking with fear and misplaced adrenaline. "You crossed the wrong family tonight." Jamal just shook his head, looking at Spencer with profound pity. "You really want to make that call?" Spencer Jamal asked calmly. "Because once the authorities get here, you cannot undo what is about to happen to you." The tension in the room was pulled so tight it felt like the very walls were going to crack. We were standing right on the absolute edge of a massive cliff. Beverly and Spencer thought they were about to throw us off, but they had no idea they were the ones standing on crumbling ground. The tiny pieces of the destroyed check were still settling into the fibers of the expensive woven rug when Beverly completely snapped. I watched the exact moment her fragile grip on reality finally shattered. She dropped to her knees, scrambling frantically over the floorboards, trying to gather the tiny torn shreds of thick bank paper, as if she could somehow tape them back together and magically restore her fake fortune. Her perfectly manicured nails scraped against the hard floor, making a pathetic scratching sound that filled the dead silence of the entire room. When she realized it was entirely hopeless, she let out a guttural scream of pure, unfiltered rage. It was a terrifying sound that came from the very bottom of her lungs. She scrambled back to her feet, her chest heaving heavily. She looked wildly around the room until her eyes locked onto her designer handbag, resting on the grand piano. She rushed over and practically ripped the bag open to grab her solid gold smartphone. Her fingers were trembling so violently that she dropped the expensive phone onto the floor once before managing to scoop it back up and aggressively punch in 3 digits. 911. Jamal took a slow, deliberate step forward, his eyes narrowing. "Beverly, what do you think you are doing?" he asked, his voice dangerously low and commanding. Beverly completely ignored him, pressing the phone tightly against her ear. Her face was flushed dark red with absolute fury, but the exact second the emergency dispatcher answered the line, her entire demeanor shifted. It was honestly terrifying to witness how quickly she could manipulate reality. In a fraction of a second, she completely dropped her enraged screaming and instantly morphed into a terrified, helpless victim. "Oh, thank God you answered!" She cried into the phone, forcing a massive fake sob into her throat. Please, you have to send the police right away. We are under attack in our own home. There is a deranged, violent man who forced his way into our house. He is destroying our property and violently threatening my family. Please hurry, he is completely unhinged and I fear for our lives. She rattled off her prestigious country club address, emphasizing the affluent neighborhood to ensure an immediate aggressive police response. She looked right at my grandfather Harrison while she told these blatant malicious lies to the dispatcher. She was actively weaponizing the police against an 82-year-old man simply because he had calmly exposed her financial lies. She hung up the phone and slammed it onto the piano, smiling a wicked, twisted smile through her fake crocodile tears. They are dispatching multiple units right now, she hissed venomously, her true colors shining through again. You are going to spend the holidays in a cold concrete holding cell, you filthy old beggar. When the police get here, they are going to drag you out in handcuffs, and I am going to press every single charge I possibly can. Spencer had been standing near the fireplace, sweating through his tailored shirt, looking entirely useless. But the moment Beverly made the police call, a sudden wave of false bravery washed over him. He realized this was his desperate chance to finally look like the alpha male of the house. He needed to prove his loyalty to his mother and assert dominance over the situation to save whatever tiny shred of his fragile ego remained. He cracked his knuckles, trying to look physically intimidating, and took a wide, aggressive stance. You heard her, old man, Spencer yelled, pointing a shaking finger directly at Harrison. The police are on their way, but I am not going to just stand here and let you disrespect my wealthy mother in her own house. I am making a citizen arrest right now for trespassing and grand vandalism. Harrison did not even blink. He just stood there in his damp wool coat, his hands resting calmly in his pockets, completely unbothered by Spencer and his loud, pathetic threats. Harrison had faced down ruthless corporate billionaires in boardrooms across the globe. A weak, entitled mama boy was absolutely nothing to him. Harrison and his absolute quiet calm only infuriated Spencer further. Spencer could not handle the fact that nobody in the room was afraid of him. He let out a loud, angry yell and suddenly lunged forward. He threw his entire body weight toward Harrison, his fists raised wildly, preparing to physically tackle an 82-year-old man to the ground just to make himself feel powerful. Spencer never even made it halfway across the room. Jamal moved with blinding, terrifying speed. Jamal was a college athlete before he became a forensic accountant, and he was entirely built out of solid muscle and unyielding moral principles. He closed the distance in 2 massive strides, cleanly intercepting Spencer right in the middle of his cowardly attack. Jamal did not even throw a punch. He simply lowered his broad shoulder, caught Spencer right in the chest, and used Spencer and his own reckless momentum completely against him. He grabbed Spencer by the collar of his expensive dress shirt and the belt of his slacks, lifting him completely off his feet for a split second before slamming him violently down onto the hard marble floor. The heavy, sickening thud of Spencer hitting the stone echoed loudly through the entire house. All the breath left Spencer and his lungs in a loud, pathetic wheeze. Before Spencer could even comprehend what had just happened, Jamal was kneeling right on top of him. Jamal pinned Spencer and his chest firmly to the floor with one heavy knee, locking Spencer and his arms securely behind his back in a flawless restraint hold. Spencer gasped for air, his face turning bright red as he squirmed helplessly underneath Jamal and his overwhelming physical strength. "Stay down, Spencer," Jamal ordered, his voice echoing with absolute authority. "Do not even think about moving a single muscle. You were really going to attack an 82-year-old man? Are you entirely out of your mind? You are a complete disgrace to the word husband, and you are a miserable coward. Let him go!" Beverly screamed hysterically, running forward, but stopping dead in her tracks when Jamal shot her a lethal warning glare. "You are assaulting my son!" she shrieked, clutching the sides of her head. "The police are coming, and they are going to arrest you too, Jamal. You have no right to put your hands on my son." Jamal kept his knee firmly planted on Spencer and his back, ignoring Beverly and her frantic screaming. I am protecting an elderly guest from an unprovoked physical assault, Jamal stated calmly and clearly, making sure his words were perfectly articulated for anyone who might be recording the situation. When those officers arrive, Beverly, I will be more than happy to give them my official statement. I will tell them exactly how you filed a false police report and how your son attempted a violent physical assault. So please keep yelling. You are only digging your own grave deeper. I stood watching the entire chaotic scene unfold with absolute clarity. My husband was pinned to the floor, whining in pain, and my mother-in-law was hyperventilating over a pile of torn paper. They thought calling the police was their ultimate trump card to regain control. They had absolutely no idea that Harrison was already 10 steps ahead of them, and the authorities rushing toward the house were not coming to arrest my grandfather. They were coming to completely dismantle Beverly and her fake criminal empire. The heavy breathing of my husband pinned to the marble floor and the frantic hyperventilating of my mother-in-law filled the massive living room. Jamal kept his knee firmly pressed into Spencer and his back refusing to let him move even a single inch. Beverly was still clutching her phone, staring at the front door, as if she expected a heavily armed SWAT team to burst through the wood at any second. She was so completely absorbed in her own victim narrative that she completely failed to notice Harrison stepping closer to the glass coffee table. My grandfather had not flinched when Spencer charged at him. He had not flinched when Beverly screamed those terrible lies to the emergency dispatcher. He simply reached a weathered hand deep into the inner pocket of his worn-out green wool coat. For a brief second, Beverly actually gasped, taking a step backward, perhaps letting her paranoid mind believe this old man was reaching for a weapon. But Harrison did not pull out a weapon. He pulled out a sleek, heavy black leather folder. It was entirely out of place in his calloused hands. The leather was pristine and polished, catching the warm light of the crystal chandelier above. He tossed the heavy folder onto the glass coffee table, right beside the predatory postnuptial agreement Spencer had tried to force me to sign. The heavy thud of the leather hitting the glass made Beverly jump. Harrison then reached into his other pocket and pulled out a solid metal identification card attached to a thick lanyard. He dropped the card right on top of the black folder. Beverly stared at the objects on the table, her eyes darting frantically between the shiny metal card and my grandfather and his calm expression. The leather folder had a massive, intricate crest embossed on the front cover in pure gold leaf. It was a crest Beverly knew incredibly well. It was the exact same crest that was printed on the top left corner of the $500,000 check she had just been waving in my face. It was the official corporate seal of the Vanguard Horizon Trust. Harrison looked directly at Beverly, his voice echoing through the silent room with absolute, unquestionable authority. He told her she really should have done her research before she decided to play financial roulette with my life. He said you have spent the last 10 years bragging to your country club friends about your massive family trust fund, Beverly. You have flaunted that wealth to humiliate my granddaughter and treat her like dirt under your expensive shoes. But you never once bothered to look at the actual signatures on the quarterly statements you were receiving. Beverly took a slow, trembling step toward the coffee table. She leaned over just enough to read the bold engraved letters on the solid metal identification card. The color instantly and completely drained from her face, leaving her looking like a terrified ghost. Her jaw actually dropped open, and a small, pathetic whimper escaped her throat. Harrison pointed a thick finger at the metal card. He told her to read it out loud. He demanded she read the name and the title printed on that card for everyone in the room to hear. Beverly was shaking so violently she could barely form the words. She stammered and choked on her own breath as she read the name Harrison Caldwell. But the name was not the part that destroyed her. It was the title engraved right beneath it, Chairman of the Board of Directors, Vanguard Horizon Trust. The silence that washed over the room this time was entirely different. It was not the silence of shock or confusion. It was the profound, devastating silence of absolute total defeat. Spencer, who was still pinned firmly to the floor by Jamal, completely stopped struggling. He let out a low groan of absolute despair, pressing his forehead against the cold marble floor. as the terrifying reality of the situation finally crashed down on his incredibly thick skull. Harrison did not raise his voice. He did not need to. True power never has to shout. He looked down at Beverly, who was now physically trembling, unable to tear her eyes away from the gold crest. He told her that the check she had tried to use to steal my highly profitable tech company was nothing more than a worthless piece of scrap paper. He explained that as the chairman of the trust, he had instituted a strict policy years ago. Any withdrawal over $50,000 required his direct personal authorization and his physical signature. He had deliberately set up those financial safeguards because he knew exactly what kind of greedy, irresponsible people were trying to siphon money from the accounts. He looked Beverly dead in the eye and told her she was a fraud. He said, "You tried to intimidate my granddaughter with $500,000 that you did not even have access to. You thought you could bully her into signing away her entire life and her brilliant company just so you could pay off your massive secret debts. You thought you were the smartest person in the room just because you wear expensive silk and live in a mansion you cannot actually afford. But you are nothing, Beverly. You are a desperate drowning woman trying to steal a life raft from the very girl you have abused for 3 years." Beverly stumbled backward, her designer heels catching on the edge of the woven rug. She collapsed onto the velvet sofa, clutching her chest as if she was having a heart attack. Her entire perfectly constructed reality was disintegrating right in front of her eyes. She had built her entire identity on the illusion of vast generational wealth. She had used that illusion to control her son, to manipulate her friends, and to actively torture me. And now the true source of that wealth was standing right in her living room, wearing a shabby wet coat, looking at her with absolute unfiltered disgust. Harrison leaned forward, resting his large hands on the edge of the glass table. He told her that he had been watching her for a very long time. He had tracked every single cent she had attempted to move, every loan she had tried to secure against the trust, and every desperate financial maneuver she had made to keep her fake upper-class lifestyle afloat. He said the only reason he had allowed her to play her little games for this long was because he was waiting for the perfect moment to completely cut her off. And tonight, by trying to steal my company and burning my mother and her precious diary, she had finally crossed the absolute final line. The sound of police sirens began to wail loudly in the distance, cutting through the howling winter blizzard outside. The authorities Beverly had so eagerly called to arrest my grandfather were rapidly approaching the estate. But Harrison did not look even slightly worried. He stood tall, adjusting the collar of his worn wool coat, looking down at the completely broken woman sobbing on the sofa. He had just flawlessly executed the ultimate checkmate, and the game was officially over. Harrison opened the heavy black leather folder on the glass coffee table, and he did not rush. He moved with the slow, deliberate precision of a man who held absolute power. He flipped to the first page, which was thick with complex financial spreadsheets and highlighted bank statements. Beverly sat completely frozen on the velvet sofa, her eyes wide with absolute terror as she watched the old man she had just called a penniless beggar systematically dismantle her entire life. Harrison looked down at the official documents and then back up at Beverly. He told her that he had personally authorized a full forensic audit of all her accounts the exact moment she tried to bypass his signature last month. He said, "You have been playing a very dangerous game, Beverly, and you have completely run out of chips." He picked up a stapled packet of papers and held it up to the warm chandelier light. He pointed to the top page and stated clearly that this massive $2 million estate did not actually belong to her. He revealed that over the last 7 years, she had secretly mortgaged the mansion, not once, not twice, but 3 separate times. She had taken out massive high-interest loans against the equity of the house just to keep up her fake wealthy appearances. She now owed the banks nearly $3.5 million. The pristine marble floors, the custom velvet furniture, the imported crystal chandeliers, none of it was hers. She was living in a beautiful, expensive glass house that was currently and actively being foreclosed on by the lenders. Spencer, who was still pinned firmly to the floor by Jamal, let out a loud, dramatic gasp. He struggled slightly, turning his head to look up at his mother in absolute sheer disbelief. "Mom, what is he talking about?" Spencer pleaded, his voice cracking with genuine panic. "You told me this house was completely paid off. You told me we had millions of dollars in liquid assets and secure investments." Beverly could not even look her son in the eye. She buried her face in her hands, sobbing loudly and uncontrollably. She had lied to everyone. She had heavily manipulated her own son into trying to steal my highly profitable cloud data archiving company, just so she could use my hard-earned money to pay off her massive defaulting mortgages. She was perfectly willing to ruin my life and my business to save her own fake image. But Harrison was far from finished. He turned to the next page in the black folder and his voice dropped to a low, dangerous rumble that commanded the entire room. He told Beverly that the secret mortgages were only the very beginning of her massive financial crimes. He said you could have just lost the house and filed for bankruptcy like a normal, irresponsible person. But you are far too proud for that. You desperately needed everyone at the Oak Ridge Country Club to still think you were untouchable royalty. So you started stealing from the people who trusted you the most. Harrison looked directly at Jamal, who was still holding Spencer down on the floor. Harrison sighed deeply and said, "I am so incredibly sorry, Jamal. I really wish I did not have to be the one to tell you this." Jamal furrowed his brow, his sharp professional instincts immediately kicking in over his initial shock. "Tell me what Harrison?" Jamal asked, his voice incredibly tight with heavy anticipation. Harrison pulled out a thick stack of wire transfer receipts. He explained that Beverly had severely abused her status as a joint account holder on the minor family trust accounts to completely drain the college funds set aside for her own grandchildren. She had systematically embezzled hundreds of thousands of dollars from the secure accounts meant entirely for Jamal and his two young children. She had literally stolen her own grandchildren and their future education just to pay for her platinum country club memberships, her weekly luxury spa treatments, and her outrageously expensive designer wardrobes. The horrific realization hit Jamal like a massive physical blow to the chest. The absolute betrayal was so deep and so incredibly vile that it defied all rational logic. Jamal had worked tirelessly as a senior forensic accountant to build a safe, secure life for his family, and his own mother-in-law had quietly robbed his young children blind right behind his back. Jamal glared down at Beverly with a look of pure, unadulterated hatred that made the room temperature drop. "You stole from my kids!" Jamal roared, his deep voice practically shaking the crystal glasses resting on the wet bar. "You sat at my dining room table for Thanksgiving. You hugged my children, and you were actively stealing their college tuition so you could buy another crocodile skin handbag. You are an absolute monster, Beverly." Beverly flinched violently, shrinking far back into the deep corner of the velvet sofa. She tried to stammer out a pathetic excuse, crying loudly that she was going to pay it all back as soon as her fake investments turned around. She wildly claimed she was just borrowing the money to maintain the prominent family reputation, because in high society, perception is absolutely everything. She genuinely believed that keeping her fake, prestigious status among her wealthy friends was somehow more important than the future of her own flesh and blood. Her upper-class facade was not just shattered, it was completely pulverized into fine dust. Everyone in the room now saw her for exactly what she really was: a desperate, pathetic thief who would happily sacrifice absolutely anyone to maintain a lie. I stood there quietly watching her completely break down and fall apart. This was the exact same woman who had made my life a living hell for 3 long years. She had constantly belittled my background, insulted my late mother, and treated me like a worthless outsider because I actually worked for a living. She had burned my mother and her precious diary just minutes ago because she thought she was completely untouchable. Now she was completely exposed. She had absolutely no money, no power, and no social standing left to hide behind. The police sirens were getting incredibly loud now, echoing sharply down the long private driveway of the snowy estate. Her prestigious country club friends, the exact same people she stole to impress, were about to watch her get dragged out of her fake mansion in federal handcuffs. The wail of the police sirens echoed loudly through the freezing night air, cutting directly through the howling winter blizzard outside. The flashing red and blue lights were not visible through the frosted windows just yet, but the sound was an undeniable promise that the severe consequences of this night were rapidly approaching. My grandfather Harrison took a slow, deliberate step back from the glass coffee table, his heavy work perfectly finished. He looked over at me and gave a small, affirming nod. The floor was now entirely mine. For 3 excruciating years, I had stayed quiet in this massive house. I had swallowed my pride, I had ignored the snide remarks, and I had played the role of the quiet, obedient wife. I had let them treat me like an unwanted stray dog. But that weak version of Natalie died the exact second my mother's diary touched those open flames. I walked slowly toward the center of the massive living room, stepping right over the tiny torn scraps of the $500,000 check that were still scattered across the expensive woven rug. Spencer was still pinned firmly to the cold marble floor beneath Jamal. My husband twisted his neck to look up at me, his face covered in a pathetic mixture of cold sweat and tears. He opened his mouth and actually had the audacity to beg for my help. He pleaded with me to call off the police to talk to my grandfather to fix this massive disaster. He said we were a married team and that he loved me more than anything. I looked down at the man I had married and felt absolutely nothing but a deep, profound emptiness. I told Spencer that a real team does not ambush their partner on Christmas Eve with a predatory legal contract. I told him that a real man does not sit comfortably on a velvet couch, sipping expensive red wine, while his mother incinerates his wife's most cherished physical possession. "You thought I was stupid, Spencer?" I said, my voice echoing clearly off the high vaulted ceilings. "You and your mother thought I was just a naive, uneducated girl playing on a computer in the guest bedroom. You thought my startup was a cute little hobby that you could easily steal the moment it started making real money." I stepped away from Spencer and walked directly over to the massive stone fireplace. The intense heat radiated against my skin. The fire had died down to a low, glowing bed of bright orange embers. Right in the center, resting on top of the burning wood, were the blackened, curled remains of my mother's leather diary. The thick pages had completely turned to fragile gray ash. Beverly was still huddled tightly on the velvet sofa, sobbing uncontrollably into her hands, entirely broken by the shocking revelation of her massive financial ruin. "Look at the fireplace, Beverly!" I commanded, my voice sharp and entirely uncompromising. She flinched violently at the harsh sound of my tone, but she slowly lowered her shaking hands. Her eyes were heavily bloodshot. Her expensive designer makeup was completely ruined and running down her cheeks in dark, ugly streaks. I pointed directly to the gray ashes resting on the glowing embers. "You stood right there just an hour ago, and you smiled at me while you dropped that book into the fire," I said, holding her terrified gaze. "You told me it was pathetic lower-class baggage. You told me it was worthless, sentimental trash that was bringing down the property value of your fake $2 million mansion. You thought you were stripping away my personal history to teach me a brutal lesson about my place in your wealthy social circle. You thought you were breaking my spirit, but you have absolutely no idea what you actually destroyed." Beverly stared at me, her breath catching painfully in her throat, clearly confused and deeply terrified by my absolute calm demeanor. I explained to her that my company, the one they had just mocked as a simple data entry job, was actually a highly sophisticated cloud data archiving firm. We specialize in military-grade digital encryption. We build digital storage vaults that are so incredibly secure that not even federal intelligence agencies can break into them without the correct cryptographic keys. When you build a digital system with that level of extreme security, you cannot just use a simple password, I explained, pacing slowly in front of the warm hearth. You use something called a master seed phrase. It is an incredibly long, complex string of randomly generated words that acts as the single absolute key to the entire digital kingdom. If you lose that specific string of words, you lose access to the encrypted data forever. There is absolutely no backup password to guess, and there is no customer service line to call to reset it. I watched the realization slowly begin to creep into the dark eyes of Jamal, who was still holding Spencer down. As a senior forensic accountant, Jamal knew exactly what a seed phrase was, and he instantly understood the massive financial gravity of what I was saying. I do not trust digital password managers with my corporate master key. I continued keeping my eyes locked firmly on Beverly. Digital networks can be hacked by anyone. Computers can be easily compromised. So I kept the absolute highest level master key to my company servers completely offline. I wrote the seed phrase down by hand. I wrote it in the margins of the one single physical object in this entire world that I knew I would guard with my own life. I wrote the master key in the margins of my late mother's diary. Beverly let out a sharp, horrified gasp, her hands flying up to cover her mouth. She looked from me to the pile of gray ash in the fireplace and then back to me, her entire body trembling violently. "That is right, Beverly," I said, a cold, hard smile finally forming on my lips. "You thought you were burning a book of old family recipes and sad poems, but what you actually threw into that fire was the only physical copy of the master seed phrase. You burned the absolute only physical key that grants access to my entire company." Spencer let out a loud, agonizing groan from the floor. He finally understood the massive, catastrophic mistake they had just made. They had spent weeks drafting that predatory post-nuptial agreement, trying to steal my company so they could liquidate my assets and pay off the $3 million in secret mortgages Beverly had taken out. But even if they had somehow managed to force me to sign that legal contract tonight, they would have never been able to access a single penny of my money. Because Beverly had just gleefully incinerated the only physical key required to unlock the corporate bank accounts. They had literally burned their own financial salvation. "But that is not even the best part," I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper that filled the dead silent room. "You see, Beverly, a master key does not just protect my corporate money. That specific, highly encrypted digital vault also protects the data archives of my most sensitive private clients. And for the last 6 months, I have been acting as my own private client, using my servers to store some very interesting documents." Beverly shook her head frantically, her eyes wide with a new, profound level of absolute terror. She was beginning to understand that the trap she was caught in was far deeper than just my grandfather cutting off her trust fund. She had unknowingly locked herself in a burning room, and then she had actively thrown the only key directly into the fire. I had her exactly where I wanted her, and I was finally ready to show her exactly what kind of explosive criminal secrets that burned Master Key was actually protecting. Beverly stared at me, her eyes darting frantically from the pile of gray ashes in the fireplace back to my face. For a brief second, a twisted glimmer of hope actually flashed across her ruined expression. In her incredibly limited understanding of modern technology, she genuinely thought that by burning the physical master key, she had somehow permanently deleted the digital files. She thought she had accidentally saved herself by destroying my access to the servers. She let out a shaky, breathless laugh, wiping a streak of dark mascara from her cheek. She actually tried to mock me again, saying I was a stupid little girl who just watched her entire life work go up in smoke. I just shook my head, feeling a deep, profound pity for how remarkably ignorant she was. I walked over to the velvet armchair where I had left my leather tote bag. I reached inside and pulled out my sleek silver tablet. I tapped the screen, waking it up, and swiped through my security protocols. With 2 simple taps, I wirelessly connected my device to the massive 85-inch flat-screen smart television mounted directly above the stone fireplace. The large black screen instantly flicked to life, illuminating the dark living room with a bright, crisp blue light. The corporate logo of my tech startup appeared rotating slowly in high definition. Spencer shifted uncomfortably on the cold marble floor underneath Jamal, craning his neck to look up at the bright television screen. I looked down at him and spoke clearly. For 3 years, Spencer, you told your golf buddies that I was a low-level secretary typing up boring medical records for $15 an hour. You were so deeply embarrassed by me because I did not inherit a massive fake trust fund like you did. But while you were out day drinking at the country club, I was building a sophisticated digital infrastructure. My data archiving company just completed its Series B funding round last month. My little typing job is currently valued at $45 million. Spencer let out a choked, gasping sound. His eyes bulged out of his head, staring at the corporate logo on the screen. He had just tried to force me to sign a post-nuptial agreement to steal a company he thought was worth absolutely nothing. He suddenly realized he had been sleeping next to a self-made millionaire for years, and he had treated her like absolute garbage. But what about the master key? Beverly practically screamed, pointing a shaking manicured finger at the fireplace. You said I burned the only key. You said you cannot get in anymore. You are locked out of your own system, you arrogant little brat. I smiled a calm, chilling smile. I told her that is exactly how cold storage security works, Beverly. The master seed phrase you burned is the ultimate administrative override. It is the absolute highest level of security designed to be used only in a catastrophic emergency to completely reset the system. By burning it, you did not delete the data. You simply made it entirely impossible for anyone else to ever hijack my servers. Even if you and Spencer had successfully forced me to sign that contract and physically stolen my tablet, you could never reset the network without that book. You permanently locked yourselves out. But as the active registered creator, my daily biometric access remains perfectly intact. I held up my tablet and pressed my thumb against the biometric scanner. The screen glowed green. A soft chime echoed from the television speakers as the secure digital vault unlocked live right in front of them. The corporate logo faded away, completely replaced by a neatly organized grid of highly classified digital folders. I scrolled down the screen with one finger and stopped on a folder boldly labeled Beverly Financial Fraud. I tapped the folder, and the television screen filled with high-resolution scanned documents. The very first image was the falsified mortgage application Beverly had submitted to a major national bank. The screen clearly displayed the forged signatures of my grandfather Harrison, completely confirming what he had just revealed moments ago. Beverly let out a loud, horrific wail, covering her face with both hands. She could not bear to look at the massive screen projecting her exact crimes in undeniable high definition. I swiped my finger again, and the screen changed. This time, it displayed a detailed digital ledger of illegal wire transfers. It showed the exact dates, the precise times, and the exact IP addresses used to quietly siphon money out of the minor family trust accounts. It highlighted the specific transfers where Beverly had ruthlessly emptied the college funds belonging to Jamal and his 2 young children. The money had been moved directly into offshore accounts and then funneled straight to luxury retail stores, high-end car dealerships, and exclusive vacation resorts. Jamal stared up at the television screen, reading the exact dollar amounts stolen from his own children. His jaw was clenched so tightly, I thought his teeth might actually shatter. The undeniable digital proof of her absolute betrayal was right there, glowing brightly in the dark room. There was no denying it. There was no gaslighting her way out of this. Beverly could not spin a fake story or manipulate the narrative to make herself look like the victim. The raw financial data told the absolute truth. You see, Beverly, I said, pacing slowly back toward the center of the room. When you treat people like they are completely invisible, you tend to forget that they can see everything you do. You left a massive, sloppy paper trail of financial crimes all over this city. And for the last 6 months, I have been quietly scanning, encrypting, and backing up every single fraudulent receipt, every fake bank statement, and every forged signature into an impenetrable decentralized cloud server. Beverly was hyperventilating, practically curled into a tight ball on the velvet sofa. She was mumbling incoherently, completely broken by the overwhelming weight of the digital evidence. She thought she could destroy my leverage by burning a physical book, but she had absolutely no concept of the modern digital world. "You can smash this television," I continued, gesturing to the massive screen. "You can smash my tablet into 1,000 pieces. You can burn this entire fake $2 million mansion straight down to the foundation, but it will not make a single difference. My servers are decentralized across 4 different continents. That data is completely immortal. And the best part is, I have already granted read-only access to my grandfather and his entire team of corporate lawyers." The howling winter wind outside was suddenly drowned out by the incredibly loud, unmistakable screech of heavy tires pulling into the long, snowy driveway. The red and blue flashing lights finally pierced through the frosted living room windows, painting the dark walls with frantic, chaotic colors. The authorities had officially arrived. Beverly had called them thinking she was going to have an innocent old man arrested, but instead she had invited federal investigators directly into a home filled with fully documented digital proof of her massive financial felonies. I looked down at my tablet, closed the secure folder, and locked the screen. I slipped the device safely back into my designer tote bag. I looked at the flashing police lights reflecting off the expensive crystal chandelier, and then I looked down at my cowardly husband still pinned to the marble floor. The trap had not just closed around them, it had completely crushed their entire universe. The flashing red and blue lights of the police cruisers outside continued to pulse through the frosted living room windows, painting the walls with a chaotic, frantic energy. Beverly was still curled into a tight, pathetic ball on the velvet sofa, completely broken by the overwhelming digital evidence I had just displayed on the television screen. My grandfather Harrison stood silently near the fireplace, watching the absolute destruction of her fake upper-class empire with quiet satisfaction. But the absolute final blow of the night was not going to come from me or my grandfather. It was going to come from the one person Beverly had constantly belittled and insulted all evening. Jamal slowly shifted his weight on the cold marble floor. He had kept my cowardly husband firmly pinned down this entire time, but now he decided it was time to let Spencer sit up and face his own personal judgment. Jamal grabbed Spencer by the collar of his expensive tailored dress shirt and hauled him up into a seated position, shoving him hard against the base of the velvet sofa. Spencer gasped for air, rubbing his shoulder and looking around the room with wild, terrified eyes, like a trapped rat looking for an escape route that simply did not exist. Jamal stood up to his full, towering height, smoothing out his clothes with absolute professional dignity. He looked over at his wife Nia, who was standing near the grand foyer, and gave her a small, silent nod. Nia immediately understood. She walked over to the entryway console table, picked up Jamal and his heavy brown leather briefcase, and carried it right into the center of the living room. She handed it to her husband, looking down at her brother Spencer with an expression of profound disgust. She had completely washed her hands of her own toxic family. Jamal took the briefcase and placed it carefully onto the glass coffee table right next to the shattered pieces of the worthless $500,000 check. The sharp metallic snap of the brass locks, echoing in the quiet room, sounded like a prison door locking shut. Jamal opened the leather flap and reached inside, pulling out a thick, heavy document bound in a transparent plastic cover. It was a highly detailed, comprehensive financial dossier. Jamal looked down at Spencer, his voice echoing with the cold, hard authority of a senior forensic accountant who had spent his entire career hunting down corporate criminals. He said, "You really thought you were the smartest guy in the room tonight, Spencer. You and your mother thought you had engineered the perfect financial trap to steal Natalie and her company. But you made one massive critical mistake. You forgot what I do for a living. You forgot that I spend 40 hours a week tracking hidden assets analyzing offshore bank accounts, and destroying people who think they can outsmart the system. Spencer swallowed hard, his Adam apple bobbing nervously in his throat. He tried to speak, but absolutely no words came out. He just stared up at the thick bound document in Jamal, and his hands completely paralyzed by fear. Jamal flipped open the cover of the report. He explained that a few weeks ago he had started noticing some strange financial anomalies regarding the family trust distributions. Because Beverly was so obsessed with bragging about her fake wealth, she had accidentally let slip a few details about a new mortgage that simply did not make any logical sense. So Jamal did exactly what he does best. He started digging. He ran a completely independent, quiet forensic audit on the entire family. And what he found regarding Beverly was horrific, but what he found regarding Spencer was an entirely different level of personal betrayal. Jamal turned the page and looked directly into Spencer and his terrified eyes. He told Spencer that he had tracked every single bank account tied to his social security number, including the joint savings account he shared with me. My heart felt heavy in my chest, but I kept my face entirely completely blank. I had suspected something was wrong with our finances for a while, which was exactly why I had quietly begun securing my company servers. But hearing Jamal confirm it out loud made the betrayal so much more real. Jamal read the exact numbers straight from the official audit. He explained that for the last 8 months, Spencer had been systematically draining our joint savings account. This was the specific account we had set up together to save for our future, to build our emergency fund, and to eventually buy a home of our own. Spencer had been making multiple quiet transfers every single week. He was incredibly careful to keep each individual transfer just under the federal reporting limit of $10,000. It was a classic illegal financial tactic called structuring, designed specifically to avoid triggering any automatic fraud alerts from the banking system. "You bled your own wife dry," Jamal said, his voice practically shaking with righteous anger. "You stole $185,000 from the woman you married. You took the money she earned from her incredibly hard work and you funneled it directly into a fake shell company registered in your mother and her name." Spencer raised his hands defensively, completely panicking. He stammered out a pathetic, miserable excuse. He claimed it was not stealing. He swore he was just temporarily borrowing the money to help his mother cover a massive margin call on some bad investments. He promised he was going to put every single penny back as soon as they forced me to sign the post-nuptial agreement and took over my company. He actually tried to justify his massive theft by claiming he was just protecting the family legacy. Jamal slammed the heavy audit report down onto the glass table, making Spencer flinch violently. "Do not you dare lie to me," Jamal roared, completely destroying Spencer in his pathetic defense. "I tracked exactly where every single dollar of that stolen money went. You did not invest anything. You used Natalie and her savings to pay for your mother and her ridiculous country club gala sponsorship. You used it to pay the overdue lease on your luxury sports car. You used it to cover the massive interest penalties on the 3 secret mortgages your mother took out. You stole your wife and her future just to buy yourselves a few more months of fake luxury." The absolute silence that followed was incredibly heavy. Spencer hung his head, burying his face in his hands, weeping like a completely broken child. He had absolutely no defense left. His own brother-in-law had laid out his horrific crimes in perfect, undeniable detail. The independent forensic audit proved beyond any shadow of a doubt that Spencer was not just a weak enabler, he was an active, malicious thief who had deliberately preyed on his own wife. I looked at the thick stack of paper on the coffee table and felt an incredible sense of absolute closure. I did not shed a single tear for the missing money. I did not cry over my destroyed marriage. The forensic audit was the absolute final nail in the coffin. It was the exact legal ammunition I needed to ensure Spencer walked away from this divorce with absolutely nothing. He had tried to steal my company to cover his tracks, but Jamal had completely exposed him directly to the glaring light of truth. The heavy knocking on the solid oak front door echoed through the grand foyer. The local police and the federal white-collar investigators had finally made their way up the snowy steps. Jamal closed the thick audit report and tapped the cover confidently. He looked down at Spencer with a cold finality. He told my husband that he was personally handing this entire dossier directly to the federal agents waiting right outside that door. The financial trap had fully sprung, completely catching the incredibly greedy architects right in its unforgiving steel jaws. The heavy silence in the grand living room was suddenly broken by a pathetic gasping sound. Jamal had just dropped the comprehensive forensic audit on the glass coffee table, and the undeniable proof of my husband stealing $185,000 from our joint savings account was sitting right there in plain sight. Spencer was no longer the arrogant, entitled man who had confidently slammed a predatory post-nuptial agreement down in front of me just an hour ago. The loud, authoritative knock on the solid oak front door echoed through the foyer, signaling that the federal investigators had finally arrived. The absolute reality of his situation crashed down onto his incredibly thick skull and completely shattered his fragile ego. Spencer practically scrambled away from the base of the velvet sofa. He did not just stand up and apologize, he completely collapsed. He fell hard onto his knees, hitting the cold, imported marble floor with a loud thud that made me sick to my stomach. He crawled forward over the shredded pieces of the worthless $500,000 check until he was positioned directly in front of my feet. His expensive tailored dress shirt was completely soaked in cold sweat and heavily wrinkled. His hair, which was always perfectly styled, was now a chaotic, messy disaster. He looked up at me, and his face was completely covered in tears and absolute panic. "Natalie, please, you have to listen to me," Spencer begged, his voice cracking into a high-pitched, pathetic whine. "You know I love you. You know I would never intentionally do anything to hurt you. I was completely forced into this." He did not even wait for me to respond before he entirely turned on his own mother. He spun his head around and pointed a shaking, accusatory finger directly at Beverly, who was still hyperventilating on the velvet cushions. "It was her," Spencer screamed, his voice echoing wildly off the high, vaulted ceilings. "She is the one who engineered this entire scheme. She came to me crying, saying she was going to lose the house and go to federal prison if I did not help her cover the secret mortgages. She manipulated me, Natalie. She told me that if I did not get you to sign that post-nuptial agreement tonight, she would find a way to completely destroy both of our lives. I was terrified of her. I only stole the money from our savings account because she threatened to disinherit me and ruin my professional reputation at the country club. She made me do every single bit of it. I am a victim here too, Natalie." Beverly lifted her head from her hands, her bloodshot eyes widening in absolute horrific shock. She stared at her own flesh and blood, her golden child, the son she had endlessly pampered and protected his entire life. And she watched him throw her directly under the bus without a single second of hesitation. "You spineless, miserable little worm." Beverly hissed, her voice dripping with the most venomous, profound disgust I had ever heard. "I gave you everything. I funded your entire fake, luxurious lifestyle. I paid for your expensive cars and your tailored suits. And the exact second things get difficult, you try to blame your own mother to save your pathetic skin. You were the one who suggested we steal her tech startup, Spencer. Do not you dare pretend you are innocent." They were turning on each other like cornered wild animals. The polished, fake upper-class facade had completely melted away, leaving nothing but two incredibly greedy, desperate criminals fighting over who was going to take the blame. Jamal took a slow, deliberate step backward, crossing his arms over his broad chest and shaking his head in absolute disgust. He looked down at Spencer with the kind of profound pity reserved for the absolute lowest form of life. Spencer turned back to me, completely ignoring his mother and her vicious insults. He reached out with both hands and actually grabbed the hem of my dress, clutching it like a drowning man holding onto a life raft. He was sobbing so hard that his shoulders were violently shaking. Please, Natalie, Spencer sobbed, staring up at me with wide, terrified eyes. Do not let Jamal give that forensic audit to the federal agents outside. Please do not take that postnuptial agreement to a divorce court. If the police see that paperwork, my entire life is completely over. I will lose my job. I will face federal wire fraud charges. I will go to prison. We can fix this. I will go to therapy. I will pay back every single dollar I took from your account. Just please tell the police to leave. Tell your grandfather to call off his corporate lawyers. You are my wife, Natalie. You promised to stand by me in good times and in bad. I looked down at his shaking hands gripping my dress. I felt absolutely no sympathy. I felt no lingering love. The man kneeling on the floor crying and begging for mercy was a complete stranger to me. I reached down and firmly pried his sweaty, trembling fingers off my clothing. I took a slow, deliberate step backward, putting a solid physical boundary between us. You want to talk about my promises as a wife? Spencer? I asked, my voice incredibly calm and completely devoid of any emotion. What about your promises as a husband? Where was your absolute loyalty an hour ago when your mother threw my late mother and her precious diary directly into that blazing fire? You did not protect me. You sat on that velvet sofa, you took a sip of your expensive red wine, and you told me to stop overreacting. You smiled while she burned the only physical memory I had left in this entire world. Spencer opened his mouth to speak, but I immediately cut him off, my voice rising just enough to command the entire room. Do not you dare play the victim with me, I commanded, staring directly into his pathetic, terrified eyes. You are a 34-year-old grown man. Your mother did not force you to log into our joint banking portal week after week. She did not force you to structure those illegal wire transfers to avoid federal detection. You made a conscious, deliberate choice to steal my hard-earned money because you are fundamentally weak and incredibly greedy. You saw my tech startup as nothing more than a convenient piggy bank to fund your fake luxury lifestyle. The heavy, authoritative knocking at the front door sounded again, this time much louder and far more urgent. The police were done waiting patiently outside in the freezing winter blizzard. You thought I was just a naive, uneducated girl you could easily push around. I continued walking over to the glass coffee table. I picked up the heavy post-nuptial agreement he had tried to force me to sign and held it up in the air. You thought this piece of paper was going to be your ultimate victory, Spencer. But all it is now is incredibly damning physical evidence of financial coercion and premeditated corporate theft. I am not going to protect you. I am not going to call off my grandfather and his lawyers. And I am absolutely taking every single piece of this evidence directly to the most ruthless divorce attorney in this entire city. Spencer let out a loud, agonizing wail, dropping his face directly into his hands. His entire body practically folded in half on the cold marble floor. He was completely broken. His profound cowardice had not saved him. It had only solidified his absolute guilt and entirely destroyed whatever tiny shred of human dignity he had left. The loud, metallic click of the heavy front door unlocking echoed through the grand foyer. The authorities were finally stepping inside, and Spencer knew with absolute horrifying certainty that his life as he knew it was officially over. The heavy, authoritative knocking at the massive, solid oak front door echoed through the grand foyer a third time. It was sharp and demanding, completely cutting through the pathetic sound of Spencer sobbing on the marble floor. Beverly, who had been hyperventilating on the velvet sofa, suddenly stopped crying. A twisted, incredibly delusional spark of hope flashed in her bloodshot eyes. In her deeply fractured reality, she genuinely believed the universe was finally stepping in to save her. She remembered the emergency call she had made just minutes ago. She remembered telling the dispatcher that a deranged, violent man had broken into her $2 million estate. She completely convinced herself that the local police had finally arrived to arrest my grandfather Harrison and physically remove Jamal from her house. Beverly practically scrambled off the velvet cushions. She wiped the dark, ruined streaks of expensive mascara from her cheeks and frantically tried to smooth down her wrinkled silk blouse. She was desperately trying to put her fake high society mask back on. She actually stepped right over her own son, who was still curled up in a pathetic ball on the floor, and marched toward the grand foyer. She looked back at me and Harrison with a wicked, triumphant sneer. "You are all going to federal prison," she hissed, her voice dripping with absolute venom. "The police are here to arrest you for trespassing and assault. I am going to press every single charge the law allows, and I am going to personally make sure you never see the light of day again." She reached the massive front door and threw it open with a dramatic flourish, fully prepared to play the role of the terrified, wealthy victim for the local patrol officers. But the people standing on the snowy front porch were not the local beat cops she was expecting. There were no standard police uniforms. There were no local deputies holding notepads. Instead, standing shoulder to shoulder on the freezing marble steps were 6 incredibly intimidating individuals wearing dark tailored suits and heavy tactical windbreakers. The bold yellow letters printed across the back of their jackets read Federal Bureau of Investigation and White Collar Crime Unit. The freezing winter wind whipped through the open doorway, blowing snow into the warm foyer, but Beverly was entirely frozen. The lead investigator was a tall, broad-shouldered woman with a stern, uncompromising expression. She did not look at Beverly with sympathy. She looked at her like she was a highly dangerous corporate fugitive. The agent stepped over the threshold, uninvited, her dark boots, leaving a trail of wet snow on the pristine, imported rug. "Are you Beverly, the lead agent?" asked her voice, echoing with absolute, undeniable authority. Beverly nodded slowly, her arrogant sneer instantly melting into profound confusion. "Yes, I am Beverly," she stammered, taking a nervous step backward. "I am the homeowner. I am the one who called 911. You need to arrest that old man in the living room right now. He broke into my house and his friend assaulted my son." The lead investigator did not even acknowledge her ridiculous demands. Instead, she reached into the inner pocket of her tactical jacket and pulled out a thick, folded legal document. She held it up right in front of Beverly and her face. "We are not responding to a local disturbance call, ma'am," the agent stated coldly. "We are the Federal Financial Crimes Division. We are here executing a federal search and seizure warrant for this entire property. We have warrants to confiscate all financial records, digital devices, and physical documents located on these premises." Beverly let out a strangled, horrific gasp. She stumbled backward, practically colliding with the entryway console table. She looked wildly toward the living room where my grandfather Harrison was standing with his hands resting calmly in the pockets of his shabby green wool coat. Harrison gave her a slow, deliberate nod. He had not just called his corporate lawyers when he found out about her massive fraud. He had called his personal contacts at the federal level. He had deployed an entire team of highly trained forensic investigators to completely dismantle her criminal operation on Christmas Eve. The agents swarmed into the grand living room, moving with terrifying military precision. They immediately took control of the entire space. 2 agents walked directly over to the glass coffee table and secured the predatory post-nuptial agreement Spencer had tried to force me to sign. They placed it carefully into a clear plastic evidence bag. Spencer pushed himself up onto his knees, his face completely pale, raising his hands in the air as if he was staring down the barrel of a loaded weapon. He was visibly shaking, terrified that the federal agents were going to tackle him back down to the floor. Jamal stepped forward, standing tall and dignified. He approached the lead investigator and introduced himself as a senior forensic accountant. He reached out and handed her the heavy brown leather briefcase containing the comprehensive independent audit he had meticulously compiled. The agent took the briefcase, thanking Jamal for his professional cooperation. She unlatched the brass locks and quickly scanned the first few pages of the dossier. Her eyes widened slightly as she realized the sheer magnitude of the financial crimes Beverly and Spencer had committed. It was all right there, beautifully documented and perfectly organized, tracking every single stolen dollar directly to their secret offshore accounts. Beverly watched the federal agents moving through her pristine living room, opening her expensive antique drawers and taking photos of her imported furniture. She was completely paralyzed. The massive $2 million estate she had used to intimidate me for 3 long years was officially a federal crime scene. She could not bully these people. She could not threaten to call their managers or complain to the country club board of directors. Her fake wealth and her manipulative tears held absolutely zero power over federal investigators who were actively bagging her forged bank statements as physical evidence. I stood quietly near the fireplace watching the absolute ultimate destruction of the woman who had tried to ruin my life. She had burned my mother and her precious diary, thinking it would make me weak. She had tried to steal my tech startup, thinking I was too stupid to fight back, but she had severely underestimated me. She had severely underestimated Jamal, and she had completely failed to understand the quiet, absolute power of my grandfather. The flashing red and blue lights outside were no longer a distant threat. They were the undeniable reality of her completely shattered world. The federal authorities had taken over the house, and Beverly and her fake high society life was officially completely over. The lead federal investigator did not waste another second on pleasantries. She gave a sharp, authoritative nod to the 5 other agents who immediately fanned out across the massive living room. 2 agents headed straight for the custom home office down the hall to begin securing the desktop computers and physical filing cabinets. Another agent pulled out a high-definition camera and began photographing the expensive artwork and imported Italian furniture that Beverly had illegally purchased with stolen funds. The reality of the federal raid was unfolding in real time, and Beverly was standing right in the center of the absolute chaos. She backed away from the lead investigator, her designer heels slipping slightly on the polished marble floor. She raised her manicured hands in a desperate defensive gesture, shaking her head frantically from side to side. She tried to use her fake high society voice to demand that the agents leave her property immediately. She threatened to call the mayor. She threatened to call the chief of police. But her words were completely empty and utterly powerless against the crushing weight of federal authority. The lead investigator stepped directly into Beverly's personal space, pulling a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from her tactical belt. The cold metallic clinking sound echoed sharply through the quiet room, slicing right through Beverly's hysterical rambling. Beverly Caldwell, the agent said, her voice booming with absolute legal authority. You are officially under arrest for multiple counts of federal wire fraud, aggravated identity theft, and credit fraud. You are also being charged with the federal forgery of official banking documents. Turn around and place your hands behind your back right now. Beverly let out a deafening, blood-curdling scream. It was not a scream of fear. It was a scream of pure, untamed ego being violently crushed into a million tiny pieces. She refused to turn around. She actually lunged forward and tried to slap the steel handcuffs out of the federal agent's hands. That was her absolute final catastrophic mistake. The lead investigator did not hesitate for a single second. She grabbed Beverly by the wrist, twisting her arm firmly but professionally behind her back. Another agent immediately stepped in to assist, grabbing Beverly's other arm and forcing her to comply with the arrest. The sharp, aggressive click of the heavy steel cuffs, locking securely around her wrists, sounded like the ultimate final judgment. You have the right to remain silent, the lead investigator recited loudly, speaking right over Beverly's frantic screaming. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford an attorney, one will be provided for you. Do you understand these rights, as I have read them to you? Beverly was violently thrashing against the tight physical grip of the federal agents. She looked wildly over her shoulder, screaming for her son to do something to save her. "Spencer, do not just sit there," she shrieked, her voice cracking with absolute desperation. "Call my lawyer. Tell them they are making a massive mistake. Tell them I am a platinum member of the Oak Ridge Country Club. I do not belong in handcuffs. You have to fix this right now, Spencer." But Spencer did not move a single muscle. He stayed exactly where he was kneeling, pathetically on the floor, his head bowed, completely paralyzed by his own profound cowardice. He was absolutely terrified that if he spoke up or tried to intervene, the federal agents would immediately throw him in handcuffs too. He completely abandoned his mother, the exact same way he had completely abandoned me, just an hour earlier. He was entirely useless in the face of actual consequences. Jamal stood tall and silent, watching the arrest with absolute stoic dignity. He had spent months uncovering the horrific truth about how Beverly had stolen his children's college tuition. He had watched her insult his background and threaten his professional career. Now he was watching the American justice system hold her entirely accountable for every single stolen dollar. He did not smile or gloat. He simply watched the natural, profound consequences of her immense greed finally catch up to her. The agents did not give Beverly any time to compose herself. They grabbed her by the arms and began marching her forcefully toward the grand foyer. She was dragging her feet, desperately fighting against their momentum, crying and begging for someone to help her. The heavy, solid oak front door was still wide open, and the freezing winter blizzard was blowing violently onto the porch. The flashing red and blue lights from the multiple federal vehicles parked in the long driveway illuminated the falling snow, creating a chaotic disco effect across the manicured front lawn. But the federal agents and the police cruisers were not the only things waiting outside in the freezing cold. The loud sirens had echoed through the entire wealthy gated community for the last 10 minutes. In a neighborhood where image and reputation were absolutely everything, a massive federal raid was the ultimate neighborhood spectacle. As the agents dragged Beverly out onto the snowy front porch, she suddenly stopped screaming. She froze, completely horrified by the devastating scene waiting for her outside. A massive crowd of her wealthy elite neighbors had gathered at the bottom of her long driveway. These were the exact same high society people she had desperately tried to impress for the last decade. These were the women she played tennis with. These were the men she sat on charity executive boards with. The very people she had stolen millions of dollars to maintain a fake wealthy image for. They were all standing out in the freezing snow, wrapped in thick designer winter coats, staring directly at her. And every single one of them was holding up a glowing smartphone. They were actively recording her ultimate downfall in stunning high-definition video. The bright camera flashes cut through the dark winter night, capturing every single humiliating detail of her arrest. They were filming her ruined, expensive makeup. They were filming her wrinkled silk blouse. They were filming the heavy steel handcuffs locked tightly around her wrists. Beverly tried to duck her head, frantically attempting to hide her face behind her own shoulder. She let out a pathetic whimpering sound, completely crushed by the sheer magnitude of her public humiliation. "Please stop recording," she sobbed loudly, begging the crowd of neighbors. "Please turn your cameras off. This is all a massive misunderstanding. I am wealthy. I am one of you. Please do not do this to me." But nobody lowered their phones. The neighborhood gossip mill had already convicted her. Her fake upper-class facade was entirely dead. She had spent her entire life judging everyone around her based on their financial worth and their social standing. She had constantly told me I was nothing but trash because I worked for a living. And now, she was the one being dragged through the snow, looking like a common criminal, while her elite friends recorded her most deeply humiliating moment to share at their next country club luncheon. The federal agents guided her carefully down the icy front steps and marched her straight toward the back of a dark, unmarked federal vehicle. The lead investigator placed a firm hand on the top of Beverly's head, guiding her awkwardly into the back seat. The heavy metal door slammed shut with a loud, definitive thud that echoed sharply through the cold winter night. She was entirely trapped in the back of a police car with absolutely no money, no power, and no fake reputation left to save her. The heavy boots of the federal investigators echoed constantly throughout the grand living room as they systematically dismantled the fake luxury of Beverly Caldwell. Drawers were being forcefully opened, antique filing cabinets were being pried apart. The bright white flashes of the evidence cameras illuminated the dark corners of the massive estate, capturing every single detail of the massive financial fraud. The screaming protests of my mother-in-law had finally faded into the freezing winter night as she was locked securely into the back of a federal vehicle. The immediate chaotic storm of her arrest had passed, but the profound wreckage of her actions remained scattered all over the imported marble floors. And sitting right in the middle of that wreckage was my husband. Spencer was still kneeling on the cold stone floor, his expensive tailored slacks completely ruined, and his dress shirt soaked in nervous sweat. He had watched his own mother get handcuffed and dragged out of her fake $2 million mansion, and he had not lifted a single finger to help her. His profound cowardice was the only thing keeping him from totally collapsing. He slowly lifted his head and looked around the room, realizing that the federal agents were entirely focused on bagging physical evidence and had temporarily ignored him. A sick, twisted glimmer of hope suddenly washed over his pale face. In his incredibly delusional mind, he actually thought he had somehow survived the massive catastrophe. He genuinely believed that because his mother was the primary target of the federal raid, he could easily slip through the cracks and quietly go back to his comfortable life. He pushed himself up into a slightly more dignified kneeling position and looked directly at me. His eyes were wide and practically begging for forgiveness. "Natalie," he whispered, his voice shaking but laced with a pathetic, desperate hope. "She is gone. My mother is finally gone. We do not have to live under her shadow anymore. We can finally be a real family, just you and me. We can start completely over. I will do whatever it takes to fix this, I promise you." I stood absolutely perfectly still, looking down at the man I had married 3 years ago. I searched my heart for any lingering trace of affection, any tiny spark of love, or even simple human sympathy. But there was absolutely nothing left. The emotional well was completely dry. I did not see a partner. I did not see a husband. All I saw was a weak, greedy parasite who had happily fed off my hard work and then tried to steal my entire company to save his own skin. I did not say a single word to him right away. I slowly turned my back to his pathetic, kneeling figure and walked over to the velvet armchair where my leather tote bag was resting. I reached inside past the silver tablet I had just used to completely destroy his mother and her fake empire. My fingers brushed against a thick, heavy manila envelope waiting quietly at the very bottom of the bag. I pulled it out, gripping the smooth paper firmly in my hands. Spencer let out a nervous, shaky breath as I turned back around and walked toward him. He looked at the thick envelope, and his eyes darted to the glass coffee table where the federal agents had just confiscated the predatory post-nuptial agreement. He swallowed hard, entirely misreading the situation. "Is that the contract?" Spencer asked, his voice cracking slightly. "Are you going to tear it up, Natalie? Because you should. You should rip it up right now, just like your grandfather ripped up that fake check. I never wanted you to sign it anyway. I swear to you, I only brought it out because she forced me to. We can throw it in the fireplace and just forget this whole terrible night ever happened." I stopped just a few feet away from him. I looked down at the envelope and then pulled the thick stack of legal documents out from inside. The bright chandelier light caught the crisp white paper and the bold blue ink of the official notary stamp on the final page. "This is not the post-nuptial agreement?" "Spencer," I said, my voice incredibly calm, steady, and completely devoid of any warmth. "That document is currently sitting in a clear plastic evidence bag being logged as Exhibit A in a massive federal extortion case. You do not get to just burn your mistakes and walk away." Spencer stared up at me, his brow furrowing in deep confusion. "Then what is that?" he stammered, pointing a shaking finger at the heavy stack of papers in my hand. I looked him dead in the eye, and delivered the absolute final blow to our toxic marriage. This is a petition for absolute divorce, I stated clearly, making sure every single syllable echoed through the quiet space between us. I had my corporate legal team draft this 3 days ago. I signed it, I dated it, and I had it fully notarized before I even walked into this house tonight. Spencer physically recoiled, as if I had just slapped him across the face. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. The absolute shock radiating from his body was palpable. He finally realized that I had not just figured out his trap tonight. I had known about his betrayal for a very long time, and I had walked into this Christmas Eve dinner fully prepared to completely burn his world to the ground. Let me be entirely clear about what is in these pages, Spencer. I continued, my voice rising just enough to command his total attention. This document demands the absolute full restitution of the $185,000 you systematically stole from our joint savings account. It explicitly denies any request for spousal support or alimony. It legally separates every single asset we share, and it leaves you with absolutely nothing but the clothes currently on your back. And just to make sure your lawyers do not try to fight it, I have officially attached Jamal and his comprehensive forensic audit as the primary supporting evidence. Jamal, who was standing quietly near the grand piano, gave a firm, slow nod of approval. He had armed me with the exact financial weapons I needed to guarantee Spencer could never touch another dime of my hard-earned money. "You cannot do this to me." Spencer finally choked out, tears of pure selfish panic welling up in his eyes again. "You are my wife. You are supposed to protect me. I have no money, Natalie. My mother just lost everything. The banks are foreclosing on this house. If you take this to court and demand that stolen money back, I will be completely ruined. I will be homeless." I stepped right into his personal space, towering over his pathetic kneeling form. I held the thick stack of divorce papers directly over his chest. I did not feel an ounce of guilt. I felt a massive, suffocating weight completely lifting off my shoulders. I was finally entirely free. "You ruined yourself, Spencer," I said, my voice dropping to a cold, hard whisper. "You made your choices every single time you logged into our bank account and transferred my money to your mother. You made your choice when you sat on that velvet sofa and watched her burn my mother and her diary. You chose your toxic family over me, and now you get to burn right alongside them." I simply opened my fingers and let the thick stack of legal documents fall. The heavy divorce petition hit his chest with a solid, definitive thud before sliding down and resting right in his lap. He looked down at the papers, staring at his own name printed in bold black ink. He slowly reached out and touched the pages, his hands trembling so violently he could barely feel the paper. I turned my back on him for the absolute final time. I did not look back as I walked over to where my grandfather Harrison was waiting. The federal agents continued their massive raid, completely ignoring the broken, weeping man kneeling on the marble floor. Spencer was officially no longer my husband. He was no longer my problem. He was just another pathetic criminal waiting for the consequences of his own immense greed to finally drag him completely under. The heavy divorce petition rested firmly on the chest of my husband, pinning him to the cold marble floor like a massive physical weight. He stared blankly at the bold black ink of his own name, entirely paralyzed by the sudden, massive loss of his wife, his money, and his fake future. But the absolute final consequence of his massive greed had not even arrived yet. My grandfather Harrison had completely orchestrated this entire night with the ruthless precision of a master chess player, and he was not going to leave a single loose end tying me to this incredibly toxic family. Harrison gave a sharp, deliberate nod toward the grand foyer. A tall, incredibly sharp-looking man in a tailored charcoal gray suit, who had quietly walked in directly behind the federal investigators, finally stepped out of the dark shadows and walked directly into the center of the brightly lit living room. This man was not wearing a federal tactical windbreaker. He was carrying a pristine leather briefcase and possessed the cold, calculated demeanor of a top-tier corporate bulldog. He was the senior legal representative for the Vanguard Horizon Trust, and he had come with a very specific set of uncompromising instructions. He stopped right in front of Spencer, looking down at my pathetic, kneeling husband with absolute professional detachment. Spencer blinked up at him, his bloodshot eyes wide with fresh, absolute panic. He had just been handed divorce papers by his wife, and now another suited man was standing over him, holding a crisp, white legal document. The corporate lawyer cleared his throat, and his deep, authoritative voice carried easily over the loud, chaotic sounds of the ongoing federal raid. He addressed Spencer directly, formally stating his full legal name. He explained that due to the overwhelming, undeniable evidence of massive financial fraud, aggravated forgery, and multiple severely defaulted loans, the primary lending institution was executing an immediate asset seizure. The corporate lawyer held out the crisp white document, dropping it right on top of the divorce petition resting in the lap of Spencer. "This is an official notice of foreclosure and immediate eviction," the lawyer stated with absolute zero sympathy. "The massive $3 million debt your mother secretly secured against this property has been in severe default for over 6 months. Because she used forged corporate trust documents to secure those illegal loans, the property is no longer protected by standard residential eviction timelines. The bank officially owns this entire estate, and they are taking immediate physical possession of the premises tonight." Spencer stared at the foreclosure notice as if it were a highly venomous snake resting directly on his legs. He shook his head wildly, refusing to accept the brutal, devastating reality of the words printed on the page. "You cannot do this!" he cried out, his voice cracking into a loud, hysterical pitch. "You cannot kick me out of my own house. It is Christmas Eve. There is a massive, freezing winter blizzard raging outside. You have to give me 30 days. You have to give me proper legal notice. I know my rights as a homeowner. I am a wealthy, respected member of this affluent community. You cannot just throw me out into the deep snow like a common, worthless stray dog." The lead federal investigator, who was actively directing the evidence collection nearby, turned around and walked over to the coffee table. She looked down at Spencer with a harsh, uncompromising glare that immediately silenced his pathetic screaming. "You are not a homeowner, Spencer," she stated, her voice entirely flat and incredibly authoritative. "You are currently an active suspect in a massive federal wire fraud conspiracy, living inside a stolen crime scene. This entire property, every piece of expensive furniture, every piece of imported artwork, and the very roof over your head was completely financed by stolen money and forged federal documents. You have absolutely no legal rights to anything inside this massive house." Spencer completely deflated. The last tiny remaining shred of his incredibly fragile ego was entirely crushed under the heavy boots of federal law enforcement. He looked over at me, his eyes begging for one final act of mercy. He desperately wanted me to tell the federal agents to let him stay. He wanted me to offer him a warm place to sleep. But I just stood there next to my grandfather with my head held high, completely entirely silent. I owed this cowardly man absolutely nothing. He had tried to steal my tech startup to save this fake mansion, and now he was losing absolutely everything all at once. The lead federal agent pointed a firm hand directly toward the grand sweeping staircase leading up to the master bedrooms. "I am giving you exactly 5 minutes, Spencer," she commanded, her voice echoing through the large room. "One of my armed officers is going to escort you up those stairs right now. You are permitted to pack exactly one single average-sized suitcase. You may take basic clothing and essential personal toiletries only. You are absolutely forbidden from taking any expensive jewelry, any cash, any electronics, or any items of significant financial value. Everything else belongs to the federal government and the defrauded bank. If you try to sneak anything out of this house, I will personally place you in heavy steel handcuffs and drag you out to join your mother in the back of my police cruiser." A heavily armed federal officer immediately stepped forward, grabbing Spencer firmly by the arm and hauling him up off the cold marble floor. Spencer stumbled, his legs completely weak and shaking as the officer forcefully guided him toward the grand staircase. I watched my former husband slowly climb the expensive carpeted stairs, his head hanging incredibly low, his shoulders slumped in absolute total defeat. He looked incredibly small and pathetic. The arrogant, entitled man who had confidently slammed a predatory contract onto the coffee table just an hour ago was now a broken weeping shell being marched to his childhood bedroom under strict armed guard. Exactly 5 minutes later, Spencer slowly walked back down the grand staircase. He was carrying a small, cheap canvas duffel bag slung over his shoulder. It was a deeply pathetic, heartbreaking sight for anyone who actually cared about him, but I felt absolutely nothing. He was leaving behind a massive $2 million fake empire and stepping into absolute nothingness with just a few pairs of slacks and some wrinkled dress shirts. The armed officer marched him directly toward the wide-open front doors. The freezing winter wind was still howling wildly, blowing thick white snow across the dark front porch. Spencer stopped right at the threshold of the open door, shivering violently as the freezing cold air hit his tear-stained face. He looked back over his shoulder, taking one final desperate look at the brightly lit grand living room. He saw the federal agents bagging the expensive belongings of his mother. He saw Jamal standing tall and proud with his wife. And he saw me standing completely free and entirely unbothered by his dramatic departure. He finally realized that he had completely destroyed the best thing that had ever happened to him. The federal officer placed a firm hand on the back of Spencer and pushed him forward directly out into the brutal, raging winter blizzard. The massive solid oak doors swung shut behind him, closing with a loud, heavy thud that permanently locked him out of my life forever. 6 months have passed since that freezing Christmas Eve, when the heavy, solid oak doors of the fake $2 million mansion slammed shut on my former life. The brutal winter snow has long melted away entirely, replaced by the warm, bright sunshine of a beautiful early summer in the city. The massive, chaotic storm that tore through my existence is completely over, leaving behind a pristine, clear sky. I am sitting in the corner office of my new corporate headquarters, looking out over the skyline and reflecting on the incredible, absolute power of the American legal system. When you build your entire empire on a foundation of lies and stolen money, the inevitable collapse is not just painful, it is incredibly absolute. The toxic kingdom my mother-in-law and my husband tried to rule has been completely pulverized into fine dust. Beverly Caldwell did not get the quiet, polite slap on the wrist she so arrogantly expected. In her deeply delusional mind, she genuinely believed she could charm her way out of federal indictments, just like she used to charm her way out of paying the valet at the country club. But federal prosecutors do not care about prestigious social memberships, and they absolutely do not care about fake high society status. With the comprehensive forensic audit provided by Jamal and the undeniable digital evidence pulled directly from my encrypted cloud servers, her criminal trial was incredibly short. She faced a massive mountain of undeniable physical and digital proof documenting severe wire fraud, aggravated identity theft, and the horrific embezzlement of her own grandchildren and their college funds. Her expensive defense attorney could not do a single thing to save her from the absolute truth. Today, Beverly is officially serving a 72-month sentence in a minimum security federal correctional institution. There are no imported silk blouses or custom-tailored dresses in her new wardrobe. She wears a standard-issue khaki uniform every single day. There are no expensive cinnamon candles or imported Italian marble floors. She sleeps on a thin mattress in a tiny concrete cell, surrounded by people who do not care even a little bit about her fake generational wealth. I recently heard from a mutual acquaintance that she lost all of her wealthy friends the exact second the local news broadcasted the high-definition footage of her being marched out of her mansion in heavy steel handcuffs. The elite social circle she sacrificed absolutely everything to impress completely erased her name from their directories overnight. She is entirely alone, trapped in a cold institutional reality with absolutely nothing but her own massive regrets. As for my former husband Spencer, his profound cowardice did not save him from the devastating consequences of his actions. The divorce proceedings were incredibly brutal and entirely one-sided, because he had actively participated in a federal wire fraud conspiracy to steal my money. The family court judge showed him absolutely zero mercy. The predatory post-nuptial agreement he tried to force me to sign on Christmas Eve was admitted directly into evidence as proof of his extreme financial coercion. I was awarded full and immediate restitution for the $185,000 he systematically stole from our joint savings account. Without his mother and her stolen wealth to constantly prop him up, Spencer was forced to file for absolute personal bankruptcy. He has absolutely no assets, no savings, and no future in the corporate business world. His professional reputation in this city is completely permanently destroyed. He now lives in a tiny, cramped studio apartment above a noisy laundromat on the absolute outskirts of the city. To pay off his massive mounting legal fees and the court-ordered restitution he owes me, Spencer is currently working the graveyard shift at a local 24-hour gas station. The incredibly arrogant man who used to swirl expensive red wine on a custom velvet sofa and mock my career as a simple typing job is now spending his nights mopping dirty linoleum floors and ringing up cheap snacks for late-night travelers. I drove past that exact gas station once late at night coming home from a successful corporate dinner. I saw him clearly through the bright fluorescent windows wearing an ugly polyester uniform, looking incredibly exhausted and entirely broken. He was wiping down a hot dog roller, looking like a man who had completely aged 10 full years in just 6 short months. I did not stop my car. I did not roll down the window to say a single word or gloat about my massive success. I just kept driving, feeling an incredible, profound sense of total closure. The massive $2 million estate they used to torture me was fully repossessed by the lending banks and sold at a massive public auction. The final proceeds barely covered a tiny fraction of the incredibly massive debt Beverly had secretly accumulated over the years. Their entire fake empire was nothing more than a highly fragile house of cards, waiting for the truth to blow it completely down. They honestly thought they were the architects of my destruction, but they were actually digging their own massive graves the entire time. The American legal system had stepped in and completely crushed their toxic delusions, leaving them both with the exact kind of miserable, empty lives they always truly deserved. The nightmare was completely over, and I was finally entirely free. It has been exactly 2 years since that freezing Christmas Eve, when the heavy, solid oak doors of that fake $2 million mansion slammed shut behind my former husband. Today, I stood on the massive balcony overlooking the bustling trading floor of the New York Stock Exchange. The massive room was buzzing with an incredible electric energy. My cloud data archiving company, the exact same tech startup that my ex-husband and his incredibly toxic mother repeatedly dismissed as a simple typing job, was officially going public. As I reached out and firmly pressed the button to ring the opening bell, the massive digital screens illuminated across the room, flashing my corporate ticker symbol in bright green lights. We opened the trading day at a valuation that far exceeded even our most optimistic initial projections, permanently cementing our status as a major dominant player in the global tech industry. I looked down at the cheering crowd of seasoned brokers and eager investors, and I felt a profound, overwhelming sense of absolute peace. The incredibly difficult journey from a small guest bedroom office in a deeply toxic household to a publicly traded corporation was exhausting, but every single late night and every single sacrifice had finally culminated in this beautiful, undeniable reality. I had successfully built a massive empire not on a fragile foundation of lies and forged banking signatures, but on genuine hard work and absolute unwavering integrity. Standing right beside me on that prestigious balcony, clapping louder and smiling wider than anyone else in the entire room, was Jamal. When it came time to select a permanent chief financial officer to guide my rapidly expanding company through the incredibly complex initial public offering process, there was absolutely only one person I trusted with my financial life. I had officially hired Jamal 6 months prior, pulling him away from his senior corporate accounting firm to help me build our new executive leadership team. He was the brave man who had physically protected my elderly grandfather from a violent assault. He was the brilliant forensic accountant who had meticulously exposed the massive financial fraud that almost destroyed my entire future. Jamal brought an unparalleled level of financial brilliance and strict ethical standards to my corporate boardroom. But far more importantly, he brought genuine, unconditional loyalty. We stood there together on that balcony watching the stock numbers climb higher and higher, and we shared a quiet, knowing look. We had both survived the incredibly toxic hurricane of the Caldwell family, and we had both emerged infinitely stronger and vastly more successful. He was no longer just my brother-in-law. He was my most trusted business partner and one of my absolute closest friends in the entire world. Later that evening, we did not celebrate our massive financial victory at an exclusive, pretentious country club. We did not rent out a loud VIP room at a five-star restaurant just to show off our new wealth to a bunch of superficial strangers. Instead, we gathered around a large, rustic wooden dining table in my beautiful new home. The house was not a massive echo chamber of fake luxury. It was a warm, incredibly comfortable, sunlit home filled with genuine love and real, honest laughter. Harrison sat at the head of the table wearing a comfortable, soft wool sweater, looking happier and more deeply relaxed than I had ever seen him. He was telling a long, funny story about his early days in the banking industry, while Jamal and his beautiful wife Nia laughed warmly from across the table. Jamal and Nia had brought their 2 young children who were currently playing happily in the adjacent living room, completely safely unaware of the dark financial theft they had been entirely saved from. I looked around the warm dining room at the faces of the people who actually loved me. There was no walking on eggshells. There were no cruel backhanded compliments. There was no manipulating each other for money or fake social status. It was just pure unconditional support. This was my new chosen family. They were the brave people who stood by me when I was completely backed into a terrifying corner, and they were the exact people I actively chose to bring with me to the absolute top. The ashes of my mother and her precious diary may have been swept away a long time ago, but the profound, beautiful lesson she left behind remains permanently etched into my soul. She taught me that true wealth is never measured by the prestigious zip code you live in or the expensive designer labels you wear. True wealth is having the absolute freedom to be exactly who you are without ever apologizing to anyone. Sometimes, the people who share your blood or the people you marry into turn out to be the most dangerous heavy anchors holding you down. It is incredibly painful to finally realize that the family you desperately wanted is actually the very thing destroying your internal peace. But you have to find the incredible courage to cut those deeply toxic ties. You have to be entirely willing to walk away from the table when basic respect is no longer being served. Establishing a firm absolute boundary is never an act of cruelty. It is an act of profound necessary self-preservation. You are absolutely allowed to protect your energy, your finances, and your emotional well-being from the people who refuse to treat you with basic human decency. Have you ever found yourself in a painful situation where you had to completely cut off a toxic family member to protect your own sanity and your future? How did you find the strength to finally walk away and build your own chosen family from the ground up? I would absolutely love to hear your personal stories and your experiences down in the comments below. Reading your unique stories reminds all of us that we are never truly alone in these difficult emotional struggles. If my story resonated with you today, and gave you a little bit of hope or courage, please take a quick second to hit the like button. Do not forget to subscribe to the channel so we can continue sharing these powerful stories of survival and absolute triumph. Share this video with anyone in your life who might be struggling with a toxic family dynamic right now and desperately needs a strong reminder of their own incredible worth. Thank you so much for watching, and remember that your past does not dictate your future. You have the absolute power to rewrite your entire story starting right now.